Okay.
Okay, so we're recording now. This is our first meeting, and we're really focused on exploring what we can do in terms of supporting the multi-family and multi-generational home population of South Los Angeles. There has been some increases in incidence of COVID among aging Latinos, and so we really want to explore how can we be supportive when we know that people living in these multi-situations really can't comply with social distancing requirements. And because we don't have a vaccine, and because everything is somewhat reactive in terms of how we're managing the pandemic, we really have to figure out how we can close these gaps. So today's meeting was to go over a couple of proposals that have already been written up, and we can kind of get a sense of how we feel about it. I spoke briefly with Dr. Young, and I've spoken with Lizette, and I wanted to make sure that the team was aware of kind of that feedback, because while we should do something about this, it's really important. I also think it's equally important to put a focus on it, just for our own development as a university moving forward, because the demographics of South LA have shifted. And we do need to, I believe, make some effort to keep up with those shifts in terms of setting priority areas. So anywho, I am going to share my screen now, and I'm going to show you the initial proposal that I mentioned in the CDU COVID meeting. Mm-hmm. And that's right here. So this was a grant that I submitted to like a number of different organizations, and I won't find out about the funding for about a month or two. But as per usual, the funding usually is not the primary driver for doing these things, because you tend to get funding after you have proof of concept. Mm. But the idea was using Photo Voice to explore social distancing in these multi-gen households among Latinos. And specifically, what are their challenges? Because we can all guess, and I think a lot of us who are kind of from here can tell you that there's a lot of things involved. But it would be marvelous to use kind of a non-threatening art-based approach to get some firsthand information about what's happening here. So, you've got the write-up, but essentially, and I'll send this out to the group, but essentially we want to gain an understanding of the barriers and facilitators specifically to social distancing, so that we could recognize informational needs and gaps. And we can, virtually kind of mobilize the community around this project as a way of not only making connections, but then promoting social distancing in a really high-risk population. And so the thought was we would do a virtual town hall, either focusing on teens and adolescents who appear to be the primary vectors at this point, or just kind of extend it out to older individuals and ask specific questions about their social behaviors. So kind of like, how do you conceive of personal space? Again, there's a lot in the sociology literature around personal space in terms of cultural variation, and for Latinos and a lot of people of color, it tends to be much smaller than they require in other communities. But also communal resource sharing. Like, are people going to family houses and there's a, communal cooking that's being distributed throughout the group in terms of traditional familism? Are people providing childcare services, multi-generational childcare services for different families within their home? That's kind of the primary. Some secondary stuff we could look at is how are people adhering to their chronic illness regimens, specifically diabetes, which is a real scourge of our community, of the Latino community. So in terms of like, are they able to follow their dietary recommendations? Are they able to exercise outside? Are they able to refill their medication? And what sort of like alternatives they're using? And then again, access to care. Are they using telehealth? Are they relying on people in their community? What's their perception of getting COVID tests, which is specifically related to CDU? So the idea is we would have this virtual conference where we ask these questions, but people don't want to just talk about this stuff, right? So it might be helpful in advance to encourage people to take pictures, that's the photo voice aspect, of their reality. And so we access all this information in the conference by presenting those pictures and talking about, what does this picture mean? So if someone takes a picture of their 1-bedroom apartment and the 5 brothers and sisters they have there, which is like kind of how I grew up, we need to actually talk about physical space, and that might allow people to express kind of what their daily life is like. And we have an analysis plan and that sort of thing, but that's the essence of it. The budget is how you make most budgets, which is I took the amount that was offered and I tried to account for every dollar of it so that we weren't leaving any on the table. But I think that in theory, offering people a $25 gift card to take the photo and then be willing to attend a session is something that we could likely swing. And then it would be important to consider research assistants that would be involved with this. So that's one option. The other option that I was kind of mentioning in terms of some of the work that I've done in the past is, this was a Academy of Medicine Catalyst grant that I submitted. Mm-hmm. It's called the Healthy Aging Mural Project. And this was specifically focused on creating public art supporting emotional well-being among older adults who are living in these gentrifying communities, which tend to be Black or Latino communities. And the idea was to do an assessment of needs, and then based on that assessment, create some partnerships between the residents and these new arrivals who are often bringing some resources, kind of, foster some communication, create some expression of, collaboration through public art, and then do some pre and post testing. So these things are already created, but I do think they bring up some larger issues that Dr. Young mentioned. And that is, do we want to just do something to fix it now, which I think is how most clinicians feel? Like, we know there's a problem, stuff is going bad, we need to act now. Or do we want to kind of take a more research-based approach where we say, we can assume what the problem is. There's literature kind of around issues that are similar to what we're seeing. A lot of us are from these communities. We can extrapolate that and just assume what the issue is. Or we could take a little bit of time to dig in and really do a needs assessment through one of these projects. I'm open to hearing people's opinions about that because, I see merit to both approaches. But I do feel like we should probably be on the same page of what is our primary goal, And I will argue that I think that no matter how much help we provide the people of South LA, and it's a lot, right? Not me personally, but I know like through Dr. Young's efforts and other people at CDU, we do a lot for the community, and it's wonderful, and it's one of the reasons I love the university. But the larger thing we do is provide real rigorous research around topics that affect people of color all over the country in a way that most other universities can't. And so I don't want to leave that off the table, because there are some people who are designing interventions right now who won't have access to this information, and they will just assume the problem and run with it. And I worry about that. So anyway, initial thoughts.
Yeah, I love that idea what you just mentioned about basically, if in a way kind of like educating, right, other researchers as well about the community-based approach, just because like you said, I feel like that is a big hurdle, like the assumption part of researchers. And I think they do have to, in a way, like have the people from the community be at the table and like making sure like, okay, tell me, what are your needs? What is it that you need? Because like we have the tools in terms of like doing this data analysis, like research methods, but we don't know, like we don't live in those communities. Yeah. Maybe at some point we did. And yeah. I lived in South LA, but I don't no longer live in South LA. I moved to Whittier. So things have changed too. And so I can't assume that the needs that were back then in the 90s are still the needs from 2020.
Absolutely.
So I think it adds value to that, like definitely yeah, what you said, the second one about like making sure to also share this information worldwide about the research community-based approach.
Yeah, I think the pictures that we would be able to get from the community and the different households would really show a lot, because I mean, people can say and describe, but until you really see it like that, until other people really see it like that and they can make the connection, I think that's the huge part of this, is the visual. So if we get all the visuals, I mean, it is, in a sense, we're doing something. It's not going to be the right away thing. Solution. It's going to be the long term, I think, more for this. But then it could be applied later, a little faster. So if this gets done, if the baseline gets done, then later it can be applied faster. But the pictures is what's going to do it. It's going to be a huge thing to show. And then they're going to have a voice too. They're going to say like, oh, people want to see what we're doing right now and what we're having to do right now, and that's what people need to see.
Yeah.
So.
Now I agree. I do think that there's two ways. If we end up doing this, there's kind of the two different approaches in terms of gathering the data. So I think we have a tremendous amount to learn from our sociologists and anthropologists and like people who are trained from that perspective, who can collaborate on the project, because there's a lot of methodology that is that allows us to do some ethnographic observational studies without forcing people to engage until we really know what we're talking about. So I think there's space for that too. In addition to us doing just this photo project where we're, no matter what, they're going to give us pictures that respond to questions we formulate.
Yeah.
But again, those questions are built on internal bias, right? The bias of the researcher, the bias of like, what our interests are. And that's where I would love to reach out to like Paul and a few other people who have some background in here. Lizette has some great background in this. And I actually asked her to talk about a methodology that might be applicable in this space where we're not asking people for stuff as much as like first we're kind of going in and doing an assessment. So, do you mind talking a little bit about that?
The ecological momentary assessments? Yeah, so I was sharing with Dr. Martinez that basically we can use the EMAs to collect data in real time. So basically the way it would be done is that it has to be developed through an app. I mean, I believe there's also now websites where you can develop your own prompts, but it's not as fully developed as if you were gonna create your own app. And basically those apps, you prompt surveys in real time to whoever your participants are. So in a past project that I worked on, it was a family. So we were prompting surveys to mothers and children at the same time, but they had different questions. So we were looking at physical activity, dietary intake, and stress level. And so that allows you to record like time, and then also what they're like during that time. Okay, can you recall what you ate the past 30 minutes? So it's a little bit more easier to recall rather than like interviewing them much later and asking them to recall through the paper surveys, which we also did in our past project. But yeah, it was definitely much harder to recall that. When they were doing it in EMAs, it was much like, oh, okay, I can do this right away. And then you have a certain schedule, like morning prompts, mid-afternoon, and then the evening prompts. It all depends on the researcher, like when they want to ask those questions and what the research question is. But it's a great tool.
I think the benefit of the EMAs is that, you don't have any recall bias stuff. You also don't necessarily have people trying to portray themselves in the best light, which is what we all do. But it does open the door to us considering like windshield surveys for things that we know may or may not be an issue, like literally driving through a set area in South LA every Saturday for a month to see how many multifamily gatherings we're able to document. Things like that are not as invasive for participants, or like, you know, staking out a couple of grocery stores in the area and just taking note of how many people who appear to be above a certain age are bringing grandchildren with them shopping, right? If we were to do that sort of observational study in advance, I think it adds to the literature, but again, it's built on things that we believe are problems versus letting the community tell us it's an issue. So I think for this meeting, I'm going to keep this short because I don't want to have everybody have to watch an hour-long video, but I do think that like the main take-homes from this are going to be, how do we want to balance doing something right now, some intervention, versus something a little bit more exploratory that then adds to the national literature in terms of what are challenges to social distancing in communities of color, and how can lots of communities around the country maybe benefit from this information. Given that, do we want to do a photo voice or a mural-based, some sort of art-based intervention with the community? Or do we want to, excuse me, or do we want to do something that is a little bit more of a ethnographic type study where we're observing these communities and not kind of observing the individual, but just kind of getting a general sense of how are these issues and barriers playing out? I think there are some of these things that are a little bit more time consuming, expensive. There's also some concerns about, in terms of people's research, it's hard to set up a study knowing that you may find nothing, right? And so with the ethnographic studies, you may find nothing, and that's a real risk. So if we could just all consider these questions, I'll set up another meeting. I don't think we've decided at all how we're going to move forward, but I think that there is a consensus among the people at CDU, at least in the larger COVID group, that we really should shift some of our focus on these multi-gen, multi-family living situations, especially among Latinos, and start kind of like gearing up to do something for that specific group. And then hopefully collaborate with the groups that are currently working with churches and potentially working in group homes so that we can make sure that we're covering our bases. You know, we don't have a Latino half. I wish we did. Healthy African American Families is such a benefit to our community and to our university. We don't have something similar that I'm aware of in a Latino space. If anybody knows of one, I would love to hear about it. But people who have decades of credibility built up in their community that can then just kind of step in and do something like this, I don't think we have that. So we're really gonna have to all collaborate to kind of develop a population that might be interested. So any final thoughts?
I think I'm excited. I can't wait for the next meeting.
Yay, me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited, and I know there's others that will, be able to join the next one too. There's a lot there. There's a lot there on, I'm still trying to think of how to balance the right now. That's probably the biggest question in my head right now, is how to do that.
I think it's a worthy question.
Yeah.
So. All right. Well, have a great day, everybody. I will be in touch, and I'll let you know when we can schedule another meeting.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.